Thank you, sister. I don't know, you may have hit your mute button while you're doing that because we weren't able to actually hear you, but we could still, it was still lovely to be a part of that offering. So mahalo. So I'd like to offer a prayer at this time to complete our protocol for today. So however you come into that space right now, I'd ask you just to focus on your breath, close down the eyes, and just spend a few minutes here with me. Na akua, na aumakua, na po'ekahiko, aloha, mahalo. Aloha ka ko, aloha ka aloha mai, e molokai nui ahina, e papahana moko, e na kupuna o gargo, aloha, mahalo. We aloha you na akua. We mahalo you so much for your time here today and for the opportunity to be able to come together as a community of guides with our broader community, wherever they may be in this world, na akua. We ask at this time that you place your loving gaze upon us and turn your attention to us so that we may be shielded and protected from the prying eyes and ears of the kolohe and the kepelo. We would ask you, na akua, to join us together with the teachings that underpin the guide room and the teachings and the sharing that will occur today as we enter into a topic of importance. We ask you now, Kua, to please also extend out aloha to all beings of the cosmos that surely need your help and your attention and the guidance of the ancestors in Aumakua at this time. We aloha you. We mahalo you. We send you our short prayer, Ma'akua, with sacred and powerful words that you have taught to us for more than 50 generations. E amama, e amama, e amama, mahalo na'akua. Thank you, everybody. It's really important to us that we do protocol at the beginning of all of our guide room discussions and conversations. And as you will see that we all work in a different way. So all of the guides have a different perspective or a different understanding or different levels of training in a spiritual practice, or in some cases like myself in a spiritual lineage. So each one of us will express our spirituality differently, but the important thing is it brings us into a space of communion with the higher being, however you define that, and the ancestors, and what we call our aumakua, but you may refer to them as your personal guides and guardians. I'd like to hand over to Christina, who's going to lead today's topic.
Thanks, Julie. I just wanted to check that you can hear me all nice and clear. We're having some sound issues earlier. Is that coming through nice and clear? Brilliant. So today's topic is conscious separation, and I'd like to explore this topic from the perspective of cleaning out the friendship closet. So I'm not talking about the transient friends we have in our life. I'm talking about the ones that have been in our life for years and sometimes decades. And from my personal perspective, these have been the most challenging to consciously separate from. This has been a topic that I've had with many, many close friends, in particular over the last 18 months. So we've all been working through, in some way, shape or form, some sort of similar internal process. And at the part of it is, do I end or do I not end this friendship? The older I get, the more consciously I'm allocating my time. And it seems that the more precious my time is. And I'm now making a conscious stand and choosing not to allocate my time to people and encounters that actually bring me down, or relationships where I feel neither seen nor heard. In my unevolved years, I would play this really mean game with friends. Like I said, I was very unevolved. When I was not feeling the love in a friendship and I'd have a conversation or engagement with a friend, I'd ask them all about themselves and volunteer nothing about me or my life unless they asked. Many of them never asked. And slowly those friendships died a natural death. If I look back now at a number of those friendships, they all had very similar attributes, and I'd like to start exploring these through our conversation. There was either an underlying values misalignment, which I didn't see or chose not to see at the get-go, or our lives were just moving in different directions. I was moving one way and they're another, and they another. With some, I didn't trust them to be truly vulnerable. I didn't feel safe to share myself in that way. So the concepts I'd like to explore with my wise guides are these. Are your friends meeting your needs, and are you meeting theirs? And how do you consciously separate if that's the decision you make? And talking about that in the context of, well, friendship is a two-way street. On the one hand, we need to be vulnerable, and on the other hand, we need to manage our boundaries. So are we courageous and therefore vulnerable with the people we trust? Do they see who we are? Or do we show them an insta-perfect mask? You know, do we withhold, like I did in my earlier story in my unevolved years? You know, you might say, I was not being honest, so what outcome did I expect? And on the other hand, is where are our boundaries being crossed in friendships? And what action is appropriate to take to honour ourselves? Do your friends uplift you or bring you down? Are they supportive of your wins and also there to console you in your losses or not? You know, I talk about losing that friendship, that loving feeling, but maybe we never really had it in the first place. I mean, not everyone's there to be your soul family. And as we grow and become more sure of who we are and what we stand for, we energetically start to separate from anything that's not in alignment. And then what role does loyalty play in maintaining friendships? And when is it loyalty, or when is it cleverly disguised as a person's inability to manage their boundaries? And in all of that, I also like to explore something around grief. You know, even when we are the ones to make that conscious separation, I know personally I have felt grief when separating from some of my friends. It's like I miss the essence of who their spirit is, even if I don't miss the way I felt in their company. There's a lot there, and we may not get through any of it. But these are my musings over the last 18 months, and I have made some conscious separation decisions, and some of them have been painful. And also I've had experiences where people have consciously separated from me. So I'd like to throw that open, and in all of that, what has touched you? What has connected with you in all of that? Deborah.
Just coming off me. I'm smiling because it's huge, right? And
it's huge.
It is, and it is huge. And I kind of you're taking me into spaces and scenarios where I've experienced, and also some what it brings up for me in my conscious that I fear. I fear that scenario.
So what do you fear? What are you fearing?
So I think I fear in the boundary setting and holding it. Like, will I hold it? Am I just having a gripe? Sometimes in the friendship thing, you go, you know, this is rubbing up against something, and you know when you're working on yourself, the rubbing up against something means, oh, it's about me. What is it about me?
It's a teaching for us.
And you know, and there's a fear. The fear around that is this too much about me? Right? Am I just being a bit too self-centered? Am I being a little bit too much? It's not about me, but it is about me. And all of those, am I just making something bigger than it is? And should I be just tolerant of people's friends' idiosyncrasies, for example? Or is it bad behavior?
I mean, that's obviously part of it. I mean, we're imperfect, right? And we're going to rub people the wrong way, and we're going to have our good times and our bad times. But there are some friendships where it just goes on for
too long.
For too long.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it happens, it doesn't happen in one instance or two instances. It happens over years, or with the friends that I'm thinking of, there were two in particular, and one was part of my soul family. And that was probably the hardest one to consciously separate from.
Yeah, I had Yeah, I can call, I've had several, but I can recall one in particular where I just didn't feel that I had the tools to express myself in such a way, and it all felt a bit in such a way to be, I eventually did, by the way, but I was getting really anxious about how do I approach this in such a way to be an aloha, to be kind to that person and myself and this space that we're in, to be kind to the years that we've had together, right? And all of the things you said above, the loyalty came in, the boundary set in, the boundaries, well, the boundaries wasn't there. And that's the bottom line. And when you did try and put a boundary in place, it was just ignored. Okay, and so
to make a stand for it, and then you have conflict.
Exactly, and
it doesn't necessarily have to result in conflict, but often
it doesn't. It doesn't. But somewhere along the line, somebody's hurting, and that's the grief bit as well. Right? I know it doesn't have to be, but in very much in my scenario, there was hurt.
Yeah.
And so it did become quite unsavory scenario. That you have to work on for yourself first, because you have to be all right with it, because the bottom line is, if you're not right, nothing else is right.
Yeah,
So like you know, as much as how many words you want to use, you do have to go within. It's not a self-centered thing, it's a self-care thing. If I can't care for myself, if I can't line up to those boundaries that allow me to be in a healthy place with any individual, never mind that individual, with any individual, I have to be solid in my world to be able to step forth.
So how do we recognize when we're being triggered and that's work for us, and when it's really a boundary overstep? Like there's that dance, right? And we can get very cerebral about all of this.
Yeah.
A lot of these kind of encounters are a trigger, as you were saying earlier. It is something for us to look at, and why are we responding in this way, and why has it created this kind of oof feeling? And when is it a boundary overstep? Because values, like this whole piece of values misalignment, is actually a big part, and it's a part of whether we're talking about friendship circles, whether we're talking about a marriage, separation, and I think there's a few of us in this room that have been through that, whether it is a work colleague relationship. The tools we work with around values are the same, right?
It's the same, and it's in context of, right?
I want to come in.
Go
for it.
Can I put my hand up? Why didn't you do the put my hand up thing? This whole word, there's two things that's really interesting to me. The first thing is what you said, Deborah, and it's about self-centered. And it's really about, as I hear that, I become aware of how we have come as a community not to understand those words. Because there's been some negative connotations around being self-centered.
Yes.
Yet you cannot move in life if you are not self-centered. That's it in its positive aspect too, and I understand that. So that's the first thing that I think is a really important point. It's right up there with when I sit with clients and they tell me about their guilt around being selfish. To be selfish from a place of positive self-centeredness is an act of self-love. And we really have to start changing that level of conversation, the inside voice conversation. That's the first point I just wanted to make. And the second point that I wanted to make is this thing around values. And I don't have values in my own schema, and I don't have it in the way I move with the world, and I don't work with my clients in that way either, because this is my experience of values. They change over time. They change as you grow older or your experiences grow wider. And that's why, you know, this is a conversation we were having last week. That brings us back to the seeds of our living, because your seeds are something completely different. They are intrinsic to who you are. And if you have your seeds in place and you truly come to understand them, which is what the work is, then they become your ruler. And if any relationship doesn't feel right, or something feels a bit off, one of those seeds is going to be out of alignment. And I know that we can go backward and forward and say, well, you know, that's semantics, and it may well be. But I think from where, well, not I think, I know from where I'm sitting, in all the years of experience working with people and working on myself, I think that's another word we have to be careful about how we use and what we mean when we use that word, values.
I think for a lot of people, they use terms. I mean, we have a common usage. I think you've taken it to a very deep level. But I think for most people, they collapse. I mean, they might use, your term is seeds of living, but I think for most people, their values are things that they hold true to what's really important to them. So yeah, I'm not sure that it's, I can actually hear what you're saying, but I think most people use those terms or have that concept of those terms in an interchangeable way.
And what I'm also saying is that level of work has to be done at the front end, because otherwise we get into these relational quicksand and entanglements. And that's what often leads people, really, I believe, down that spiritual path, because things have become so entangled and everything's hooky, like pulling backwards and forwards on the same thing, but they have lost sight of what that thing is.
So let's explain that notion of, if we were clear about the seed, and I'll use your expression because I love it, the seeds of your living. If we were all clear about our own seeds of our living, do I then extrapolate it to the next step as we would not have some of these friendship entanglements, because we would be so clear about what's important to us that those relationships would become transient, or we'd clear through them faster?
I'm not sure if it is that clear cut. Like, I'm at the moment just processing all of that, because like what has been opened up feels like really big to me. There's like so many different aspects of it that a part of me is going like, oh, I don't even know where to start in all of that. So it might be interesting maybe to talk about it, if, you know, continue talking about it in the guide room. My story is a bit different, because my story, in my life, there wasn't that much of separation, but more so life led me to places where I had to let go constantly of people that are close to me. Like, I came here 21 years ago to Australia because I fell in love, and so I had to leave my family, my friends, my community behind through that process in a way. I then, after 12 years, had to go through a separation, and with the separation was not just the letting go of the father of my kids and my partner and my friend, but also a family and a circle of friends that came with that, because I stepped into his world in a way. And I'm just sort of restarting to rebuild a new community where I have moved now. So a lot of my life has been of that letting go, just was put upon me in a way. I guess what stands out for me is a way of, especially with my family at home, you work through things differently, because sometimes it can be 7 years before I can raise the funds to see my family and friends again. And so when you go home, you just want to make as much peace as you can and say all the things that are important. There's always more, but there's that real want of you know, clearing away things that I don't even have a name for it. it's like a question of, if something would happen tomorrow, if I would leave this world tomorrow, was that interaction or not interaction I had with that person worth, you know, would I do it differently if I would know that tomorrow I'm not here anymore? I've lost family and friends coming here that I never got the chance to say goodbye or make up, and that sort of has really woken something up in me. Is like so many things, a pity really in the big picture and at the end of the day, and to really sort of work through that process as well. And I guess there's common ground as well, you know. What is our common ground, and how important is that common ground to find a solution for any kind of problem we might have? In my separation, the common ground was our children, and my want for my kids to have a that the family unit is still there for the kids. And that common ground became something to process into constantly. When something came up again, you know, it was like that was something that constantly was my driving force in can that be worked through without disrespecting myself or not honoring myself in all of that. But yeah, don't know if that even fits into what you were saying, but that's what comes up for me at the moment.
What's come up for me listening to aspects of your story is that the flip side of conscious separation is conscious engagement, and you picked up that topic by kind of talking about, well, where is common ground? Because you're in a situation where you're making new friends and engaging with new friends. So this kind of brings us back to kind of where we were talking about before, is what are the aspects? Because a lot of this happens at an unconscious level, and we just go, oh, you seem nice, and you've invited me over, and I'll accept that invitation. But at what point do we consciously engage in the same way that we might consciously choose to separate? And what is in that pot? And it's a big pot, right? It's not a simple one. We wouldn't be talking about it if it was simple. What is in that pot that makes us feel a sense of belonging and at home? And conversely, what is in that pot that makes us feel uncomfortable?
But when I listened to B talking, you know, that was something that I had in my mind as well, is, you know, there's levels. I don't know what level of friendship or friend, you know, is falling into some of the things that you just said, because, you know, sometimes we form friendships as adults, you know, when people have already gone through lots of stuff. And so the commonality becomes the trauma sometimes, or the loneliness, or the desperation for something, you know, some sort of need. And yet B was also taking us back to a different level of friendship, which is the kind that you have that you make when you're children and you're at school. Like, you know, when you first introduced the conversation, I was rapidly sort of scrolling back to my friendships, and that's where I went to, because I'm still friends with the same core group of people. And we're in lots of ways very different. And over the years, I remember years and years ago, I had this conversation with a journalist who was thinking about doing a story on us because of the longevity of our friendship, and especially among women. And, you know, I remember saying to that person, if we could take the best of each of us, we'd have a wonderful composite of like almost the perfect person, the person that everybody would want to be, or the person that everyone would want to be friends with. And that's part of the secret, I think, to our longevity, is our sameness is in our complementary differences.
Yeah.
And our, obviously, you know, growing up, getting into mischief with each other becomes our shared, not giving away any secrets, like our shared experience. And that's a very different level of conversation and friendship, because it's built on acceptance, and really it's unconditional, that level of friendship. And I think I think that's another part of the conversation. Like, you know, where does that start? How do you get there? And how do you get there from when you're an adult if you haven't had that kind of foundation even? I know, I just wanted to chime in with that. That's where I went with B, and that's where I went when you started.
Yeah, a whole bunch of that's kind of history, and it's kind of loyalty, but it's also those, you've gone through those growing pains together in your very early years, so you have a lot of common stories. And I wonder if there's more trust, if trust is somehow a big part of our decisions when we consciously connect or consciously separate.
I think
unconditionality.
I think that's a big one as well, because I just want to concur with you when you were talking. I was going back in time, and I was thinking, right, who's in my life now that was in my life from X, and I've still got, it's the longest friendship that I sustain, and we are still in communication now. The extended group of girls, not so much connected, but there's one friend in particular, but I still associate, if I ever travel back to Wales, and I call it Wales now because I've noticed you called it home, right, where you are.
Yeah.
Because my family will say to me, when are you coming home? And there was one point where I'd been here for about in Australia for 13 years, and I said to them, I am home. Right? And so just that concept in itself, another conversation, but there is some kind of unitedness binding around that, right? And so when I go back to Wales, I'll see all of the friends I've seen where we've grown up through the schools. There's some people that I didn't go to school with, that we had, you know, we had horses, we had horse riding in common, and they're part of the same group. Only about 5, grateful to say. Lots of people I know, but about 5. And it comes down to, I remember doing I had revelations about some inner work I did. Oh, do you know, I did this, and I feel like I come through it, and I've worked through this, and whatever the blah, blah, blah was. And they all said, yeah, we knew you'd do that. Yeah, you just do that. And I go, well, I've just spent hours in therapy working that one out. Where did it come from? My behavior around that, my mindset, the thoughts through it. And they said, yeah, you've always been like that. And I said, well, why have you been so accommodating about that? Because some of that stuff was quite bad behavior on my behalf. And I said, how did you get so accommodating about that? And they said, well, it's just you, and that's just part of you. Like, there's parts of us that you tolerate. And there's this word called, and it's a big word, acceptance. And on that fine line, I also want to acknowledge that familiarity breeds contempt. Right? It's such a fine line.
And it sometimes is difficult. Like, I grew up in a small village, and it's wonderful as a child because that whole extended village is your family, you know, your tribe. But once you become a teenager, it becomes very difficult because there's a big price to pay for that belonging. And often that means you have to fit into that mold to belong. And so with old friendships, it can be like that then as well. You know, it's difficult for them to let you grow and let you change into somebody else, or more of yourself, really. Because that's how they know you, you know, and it's sometimes difficult in that bind to just allow somebody, especially small village where, you know, there's a lot of, it's great because it's full of tradition in my case with Austria, and that tradition only sustained because of that slow pace of moving forward and then going backwards again, you know. But there is also a price to pay for all of that. The individuality in all of that is compromised very often, or you become the black sheep or the outsider or something like that.
You get the label in a village, don't you? Because I want label. So you get your labels on your back, you are the joker, or
Yeah.
But
trouble.
in the same thing, you know, the hardest thing in the world to do is to change, like to make that decision to change and then do it. And the second hardest thing is to let other people change.
Yes.
And this goes back to exactly what Christina was talking about and what I was saying about the seeds, because it comes back to, well, if somebody else changes and you're not familiar to me anymore, you know, I'm going to make a value judgment around either I like that or I don't like that. And then that starts the whole domino effect, because we do not do our inner work around it. And often, not in every case, but often, we're not taught to. We're not taught how to do it.
We're not taught a lot of things, sadly. We find out the hard way by scraping our knees in an emotional sense, you know, having to do a lot of work and making a lot of mistakes.
And it's just so complex, you know, we humans are so complex. Like, just to understand myself will be probably a lifelong journey, you know, on all levels, let alone then to understand somebody else that is just as complex and different to who I am, and then finding a place, that common ground where you meet, you know, and where you, when is it worthwhile, not fighting for it, but working through all of that, like what makes a friendship worthwhile, or somebody that you met where you go like, yeah, like, you know, in that case with the separation was my kids that constantly kept me working through all my stuff again, to go like, you know, I need to somehow work through it, because it is too important for me to keep that relationship in a friendship way for the children and for the family unit, than just to give up on it. Would be much easier. Would have been much easier to just get completely angry and you know, and all kind of things that happen when you separate, when that pain just explodes in you, and all these things that you think have been unfair, and how can they, and how dare they, and what did they do to me, where the victim then comes out with all of that as well. And often it's just easier to walk away and say, oh, had enough of you, you know. But sometimes it's all, or in that case, these years of constantly moving through it again and trying to preserve what was important to me. It was one of my greatest teacher, really, about love in a way.
Yeah, but that point that you're just making is really to Christina's earlier point around, it's a slippery slope.
It's a very slippery slope.
Because I'm not saying this about, I'm not calling out what your value is, but I know that you have from what, even if I just was listening to you for the first time, you know, clearly you have a strong value or seed around something to do with family, right?
Yeah.
And so then it becomes, will I compromise everything because that I believe so I'm holding on so tightly to that? Like, where's the boundary around that too? Because it borders almost on a form of self-harm.
Not at all. No, not at all. No.
Yeah, but I'm saying when I hear you, that's from an outside, and if I put a therapist hat on, that's where my thought bubble is. Like, how is that boundary held? Is it held to it so tightly that it's actually becoming harmful somewhere? I'm not saying it did, I'm not saying it is, but that always is that's where my thought bubble is as you spoke.
Yeah.
What I also heard in Bee's conversation or sharing was that you can consciously separate with love.
It's not easy, but
not
definitely
easy. It's
yeah.
not easy. But what I heard in the spaces was that you consciously put time, effort, love and care into a conscious separation where there continues to be love and care.
Yeah.
But it's not, you're out of my life, you're dead to me.
And that wasn't an easy, smooth path. You know, there was many times I fell off when I was caught in resentment and anger and bitterness and hate and all of these emotions, you know, sometimes not just for days, but weeks on end. And it like, it's not an easy going path, not at all. And sometimes I had to compromise on what was important for me, for the greater good. But then I also claimed certain things back that I hadn't claimed before, because I was gaining in strength in that whole process for myself. There was a self-respect that came with it, because like one big question for me always was, who do you want to be? You know, every day when some emotion exploded in me, I asked myself the question, who do you want to be? From what place do you want to come? And that didn't always work, but it sort of just walked with me in all times. And I think with that came self-respect, because I could look into the mirror most of the days and go, yeah, it's okay, the steps you've made today. You know, sometimes even like, yeah, you've done really good, and sometimes, well, you fell off. There's a certain gentleness that needs to come with that as well for yourself in a learning process. There wasn't like a black and white in boundaries for me, and maybe I have, you know, I have not had strong enough boundaries, but looking back, it was a process. I had no idea what I was doing. You know, it was a day-to-day walking through it and seeing where it takes me at the end of the day, and then picking up the next day and walking on from there. So a lot for me is sensed emotions, you know, it's
What?
how that feel today.
Because you know that whole cutting off thing, like that's a very Anglo-Western way to think about, like Polynesians, we don't do that.
What do you mean with cutting off?
Well, like Christina said, you know, consciously separating with love. And, you know, my first husband and I, that's how we did it. You know, there was no malice involved. And when it was getting that way, because lawyers, you know, whatever, were getting involved, you know, I just said to him, like, this is my experience. And he said straight away, no, we're not doing that. You know, so, you know, I understand that whole thing about consciously separating with love. But what I'm also saying is there is a Western anglicized tendency just to cut people off, you know, whereas Polynesians don't do that. We don't okie those things, you know. The door is always open, but the door is open only really because you know where you are in all of that. Because otherwise you just keep the door open, tsunami again, and, you know, well, that's unhealthy.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something really important in the times we live at the moment, where we are so split up as a society in so many different groups that don't agree with the other group. You know, to look behind that person and look try to understand where that person is coming from, and not be just like, well, you believe that, so therefore I want to have nothing to do with you. Because that is my greatest concern at the moment, watching what is unfolding everywhere in the world, how separated we are becoming as human family in a way, in all of that. Not that I have any answers for it, but just observing that really unsettles me at the moment. So that's probably a really important conversation on so many levels that we've just opened up.
And I just, there's something in there that for me, because the interpretation that somebody may have that you've cut on away, I just want to open the door to, at times, to retreat.
Yeah.
You actually need to come back to yourself. You need to find and you can retreat, because it's something that is something that I like to do.
Yeah, totally agree.
Back into a place of alignment. Am I in aloha? Am I in a place of love? Because my next action, my next step, and my next feeling, and my next words, whatever that different scenario and whatever pain it's causing me, because generally if you're retreating, it's triggering something, my next step needs to come out of a place of goodness.
That's a beautiful place to pause, as I'm conscious of the time. Julia, I pass back to you to close our gathering.
You mute.
You're mute.
I'm just having a little trouble hearing what you just said. Sorry.
I'm just conscious of the time as we approach. Are we due to be closing our gathering now? Or are we going for another 15 minutes? Another 15 minutes. Excellent. Bonus.
Yeah, so it was, yeah, so definitely around just recovering in that position is, but hasten to add, I just want to let everybody know I've done the cut and run.
Yeah. Don't we all? So much easier sometimes.
I've had some experience.
To balance that all out, right? To balance that all out, yeah, I've done the westernized cut and run. Right? It was what I was taught, what I experienced growing up. But to come into a place of understanding the difference between cutting and running, of which, by the way, you always have to deal with it. You have to deal with your feelings around that eventually, because for me, you get grief around that. There's hurt going on around that. And so, but there's a difference between retreating and cutting and running. And they're both tactics. And they are both tactics.
And I think also to be aware that that cut and run often can come from a trauma, that, you know, a past trauma. That's the fight and flight. So gentleness with yourself is always so important in all of that.
I guess friendships and relationships are so complex, aren't they? I mean, there are some where run, some where I've kind of had some tough conversations and then we couldn't resolve them, so there was a retreat, and then you try and come back and the same stuff keeps happening, and you retreat and then you come back and the same stuff happens, and then you go, actually not healthy for me anymore. And there's just this, it's so complex. Everything, every interaction happens so differently depending on the power it had over you in some way.
And that's also about because we don't understand forgiveness. We don't understand forgiveness in the Anglo-Westernized world. We do not, because you hear it all the time. I'll forgive, but I won't forget. And our teachings, the teaching is, you know, you forgive, and if you don't forget, then you have never truly forgiven at all.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you forgive the pain and suffering or the you know, implication of it. But it means that when you recall it, it doesn't have the same level of hold over you. And that's, you know, what I think one of the things that we really have to relearn as a global community. If we're talking about, you know, being accepting, if we're talking about knowing ourselves, then part of that, in order to have less complexity, is to learn how to forgive and then move from wherever that position is. If you decide to, you know, separate or no longer have that relationship, that's fine, because it's coming from a place of true forgiveness, and true forgiveness is aloha, unconditional love. That's our teaching around it.
Yeah, and to forgive yourself as well. Like, that was interesting for me in that constant forgiving process.
Yeah, of course.
You have to forgive yourself as well in all of that.
Well, that's the process in our teachings. Ho'oponopono is part of getting to that point, because there's no, if you don't forgive yourself, you will not forgive anybody else, which comes back to the original thing we were talking about what you value and what your seeds are, and being self-centered and coming from that place. You know, pain and suffering happens because we come from an external place about it. Not from within, because sometimes, like you all said, that's a really scary place to be if you don't know that person or don't know what that's like. You know, people are so afraid of unraveling. They're so afraid of, you know, dismembering themselves almost in order to reconfigure how they want to be.
Well, of course, because being vulnerable for many of us is a terrible place to be, because we're not in control, and that's also you know, society raises us in many ways to be pleasers. It's a societal construct, and that's how we make friends, by you know, in varying levels, winning people's affections by being nice, or being the joker, or being the person that always bakes the beautiful cakes, or whatever our way is of connecting. And then you potentially lose your seeds of living, as you were saying. We're back to that again, because it keeps coming back to that. And then at what point do you lose yourself? But society reinforces those behaviors in us.
Because we're taught avoidance.
Yeah, we're taught
because we're taught avoidance from, you know, families of origin, you know, schools, play, you know, all those communities of origin, all those origin activities. We're taught avoidance. We're taught relationships based on avoidance, which is based on fear.
And then it's based on dishonesty, really, because if we're avoiding, we're not being honest, are we? I mean,
no, because we're based in fear. You know, that's where the work is, of getting to know yourself so that you're less fearful.
And I think everything in our psyche and our body is programmed to avoid pain. And that is always an interesting part as well. You know, you don't move freely into pain, whether it's physically or emotionally, or, you know, there's that protection in a way there. And that's why sometimes in my journey, without professional help, a lot of times you can't see through avoidance or through, you know, things that you don't want to see. To have the right person in place to help you walk through these places.
We're not taught to grieve. We're not given space to grieve.
Yeah.
I'm not taught to step into.
I fall over, I hurt my knee, I physically hurt my knee. All right, kiss it better on your way. Carry on. And I know that's just the most simplest of terms, but I'm trying to use that simplest of terms where that approach is that we don't grieve about stuff.
Yeah. And yet that's an Anglo approach too, right?
And
you know, and that's about emotions and not being comfortable with emotions, and, you know, especially in a country like Australia that, you know, is a colonized country, but from the UK, where being stoic somehow seems to be in the bloodline.
So Julia's absolutely right. We're not taught to step into our emotions, and in a contradictory way, we're staying away. So we keep experiencing pain. But if we actually stepped in, leant in, felt it, it's amazing what actually happens. We actually pass through it faster. It clears faster. It clears through the energy of our body faster. But we hold back. We're terrified to step in.
And it is terrifying because you do not know how long you're going to walk in the darkness. You know, I walked with that separation for years in the darkness. Like, you do not know how long it will take you to come out on the other side. But one thing is for sure, you always come out with all these treasures that you have collected in the darkness. So, you know, after all these years, it is much easier to be courageous because you know what waits for you on the other side of that. Not even the right words to put it, but it can be very challenging and scary for the, you know, the first entries into these places of darkness is not the right word, but
and that's trust again. You come back to trust again. You have to trust.
Yeah, that you are going to experience. It's the experience we fear because we've never experienced it. And so that unraveling is a fear, when actually, if you surrounded yourself with support and assistance and allowed yourself to unravel, I wonder what that would look like, or for how long you'd be there for. Exactly what you were saying. Probably it wouldn't be that long. Maybe not. We're all unique. If we don't allow to be in there, work through it, and I think trust those people are around you, your anchors. Because for me, absolutely, going into the rabbit hole, I call it, going into the rabbit hole, I needed a trustworthy anchor. That come what may, I knew that individual is constantly witnessing, observing, and holding the space to say, right, you just gone a bit too down, you're pulling you back up a little bit. But it never happened. It never happened. I went in, it never happened. I was like that, oh, this is a really cool place. Right, I haven't turned into X, Y, and Z like I thought I was going to do. Oh, I'm quite functional here. Right, it's trust, and it's having the people around you, the trustworthy. They're not fixing you. They're witnessing and observing what you need to experience.
And it's changing our framing about how we judge emotions. It's like we have this judgment around when happy is good, sad is bad. Happy is good, angry is bad. You know, there's this, and if we just reframed that and everything just is, and experience everything, and that everything is good. And in fact, there's now scientific research that actually substantiates the fact that people who experience a wide range of emotions and let themselves feel and pass through a wide range of emotions have experienced better health and well-being in terms of mental well-being. But we don't allow ourselves to feel it. We you know, shouldn't be feeling angry. I shouldn't be feeling resentful.
There's a really beautiful poem by Rumi. I don't know if that could be a nice way of bringing it to a close today, because there's so much more to talk about on that subject. I think we've only just scratched the surface.
And we do need to close because we have about 4 minutes left on our time, and I can see that there's no questions being asked. So it would be good to probably, Christina, move out of the guide room.
B, why don't you, did you want, Julie, would you like B?
Yeah, I've got it. Let me just quickly Google it up. So I've got it there to read from.
So what's the takeaway? What are we taking away from our conversation with each other today?
Conversation about conscious separation is just as much about conscious engagement. That's my big takeaway. It's about engagement. And it's not necessarily about separation. It's about understanding your place in it coming from a place of love for yourself, and therefore naturally anybody you're engaging or disengaging with. And takeaways.
My takeaway is do the inner work. You know, start with getting to know who you are. In the way I articulate it, it is in the seeds of who you are. That's the starting point. What we're taught in our lineage is life is simple, people make it complex. So you want a simple life, you've got to go back to the simple life. That's where it starts. That's my takeaway anyway.
Yeah, I'll add to yours. I think a lot of it is about being in alignment with your truth, and then you have the courage to be both honest and vulnerable, and also to manage the conversations that need to be managed if things are not in alignment with your truth.
Before you do your point, are you going to say what your takeaway is, Bea?
Well, I agree with all of you. I think they're all really, like, most of all, I agree as well with the inner work, how important that is. And also boundaries is something that's sort of present for me at the moment, and how to hold these boundaries from a place of love, self-love, and love for the other. So that's something that is sort of marinating in me at the moment for myself and all of that as well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, do you want to do your reading before we finish?
I read that poem because it's beautiful, from Rumi, and it sort of really speaks to what we have spoken to. And then maybe I use my rattle again just for a few moments, and anybody that watches that maybe just thinks about his own takeaway and places it on his heart, and I ground it in with the rattle. That's one thing that Standing Bear always does for us after he speaks. He plays the flute because they're the standing people, they ground you, and he always asks us to put what we have taken away onto our hearts, and he grounds it with that.
Then before you do that, I want to just, if we're going to end that way, there's something that I want to really apologize for, and that is I didn't do an acknowledgement to country. So I did in my prayer, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on. But I think it's really important that we acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that we're currently meeting on, past, present and emerging. And I give thanks to them for their custodianship and stewardship of the land. If you're interested in continuing conversations with the guides, we meet every week. You can join us here in the guide room, either live via Zoom or in the Facebook SOHAD School of Spirituality, Healing and Development Facebook page. If you feel that you would like some assistance from the guides, you can work with them. You don't have to be a student in the school. And here, let me just share with you how to do that. Let me find it for you. Oops. This is the school's website page. It's the online schoolhouse. It's the gateway to all of our courses, but it's also the gateway to the guides, and you can see them there. So you go to www.spiritualhealingcourses.com. You come to learn. You can go down. You can click Wise Guides, and we're just waiting for it to click through. There's a little bit about the guides, and then in this section you can flick through and you can find the guide that you'd like to work with, and you simply press the book with button and that will take you to the booking page. Done.
All right. The Guest House by Rumi. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door, laughing, and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond.
There's something very interesting to me going on, and the fact that we can't hear your rattling today, which we always usually hear. So there's something very interesting in that, and that's a conversation for another day.
Time.
So it's time for each of us to say hui ho and send you our love. Who wants to go first?
Charity.
Mit viel Liebe.
And aloha. Hui ho. This has been the guide room. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye for now.
Bye.